Hey everyone, welcome back to Test-Driven Development in React Native. It's good to be here and streaming again. Hope some of y'all join on the chat, otherwise we will catch you in the replay later. I'm glad to be back. So I didn't realize it last time, but I'm thinking that this is going to be our last React Native TDD live stream. If I was a sound effect playing streamer, I would play the sad sound effect right now, but I'm not that yet, at least. We'll see. But don't worry, we've got some cool stuff coming soon. At the end of the stream, I'll talk a bit more about that. But we want to get the last bit of our React Native app working and tested and integrated with the backend. So that's what we're going to do today. Before I got there, though, I had some interesting experiences this morning. I think they were brought on by the fact that I updated to Xcode 10 recently. And as a result of doing that, I think I had some build errors. And so this morning was time to update the app and get it building again. And in fact, I ended up upgrading the app to React Native 56. So I just wanted to briefly share that. Upgrades are a fact of life with React Native, and so I wanted to share what my experience was like this time. For a bit of context, if you haven't seen the stream before, because this is going to be a great overview stream where we walk through all of what we've ended up building, we've been building, test driving a React Native app together. And so it's been called Opinion 8. It is a list of restaurants and rating the dishes at those restaurants. And that's what we've been working on. So you can see the repo here. It's under my account on Coding It Wrong. I'll leave it starred and featured as one of the top repos so you can find it later to get back to it. And all of our changes are going to make it in there. So here's the PR that I did this morning for the upgrade to React Native 56. I intentionally started us at the start of the series on React Native 55. Because 56 was a major change where we upgraded, where React Native upgraded to Babel 7, and that's very exciting. Got to do some cool new features like private fields. But there was also some changes in the ecosystem, and not all the packages were updated right away to be able to work with it. And even still now, I still had a little bit of trouble doing the upgrades. So what had happened was when I was doing a new build from scratch of the app with Xcode 10, I was getting some errors. And as a result of troubleshooting them, I ended up updating. So let's just take a brief look at what was involved. I'm not going to go into all the details, partially because I don't remember them. I just did what I found would help me get past those points. But so let's see. So I updated React Native from version 55.4 to 56.1. I had seen, and I have demo projects like my React Native TDD website. So I had seen that React is version 6.4.1 is what goes with React Native 56.1. So I updated that as well. And then React Test Renderer. There's one other thing as well. As I was trying to build the app, the way Babel plugins work was different. And so there was a different decorators plugin now, starting with Babel 7. So instead of it just being called, let's see here, what was the old one called? Yeah. The old one, Babel Plugin Transform Decorators Legacy. Plugins in Babel are now scoped to the Babel organization. And so Babel Plugin Proposal Decorators was the version. I also found from reading readmes and bug reports online that the version of Babel needed to be exactly the same beta that React Native comes with, which is beta 47. Now, React Native 57 since then is on the full release of Babel 7, but Detox has not yet officially supported it as of last time I checked the README, and so I just wanted to upgrade to React Native 56 to give me the best chance of being ready for the stream today. So I updated to the same version of the Babel plugin as it supported. I found that there's a Babel preset that also need to be updated, which makes sense for those breaking changes. So those were our core updates here. There was also a flag to be passed in for decorators, because decorators is an ECMAScript feature that's gone through a lot of churn. So I think that got the app running. There was a build problem, and I've linked to the issues that I read on all of these. There was an error, something to the effect of multiple commands error, or multiple files were generated or something like that. So one workaround was to choose switching to the Xcode 10 legacy build system. That's only temporary. That shouldn't be needed permanently, but that was needed for now, so that got me past it. I needed to update Jest as well, so I knew that Jest had some integrations with Babel, and so the Babel Jest integration needed to be updated. And then there was some need to make the Babel versions explicit. So these links are actually wrong here in the description of the repo. The description of the PR, if you need it, those links are updated there. But I found that I explicitly had to acknowledge a Babel core version. This Babel Core 7000 is actually a shim to take the old Babel package name and tell other packages not to use it. So you need to put this in there when you're using older packages as well. And this was a thing I found that needed to be put in to make sure that It was either to transform modules in the React Native package or to not transform them. I'm not sure which one, but that's okay because when you're Googling and you're finding stuff on Stack Overflow, you just get stuff running. So the bottom line is there was a few different changes, and it was not too bad, and now we're running on React Native 56, which is nice and very cool. So what's next? One of the things that I was working on and kind of got stuck on at the end of last stream was getting the app running in test mode and in production mode. So you may recall that we took our API and we set it up with a fake version and a real version. I see that Juddy has joined. Hey Juddy, how's it going? I think you were out a week and then I was not streaming last week, so it's been a little while. So I'm glad you could join me for this one. Hope you stick around and find out what we're going to be streaming starting next week after the React Native stream goes on, and maybe you'll be interested in that too. So for the API, we created a fake version and a real remote version, and we want to switch between them. We used a package called, what was it called? Let's find out what it was called. React Native Config to load these env files. And we're in the kind of real production use, we're using the remote API, and then for detox testing, we're using the fake API instead. Jetty says it better be good. We'll see. We'll see what you think about that. Cool. So I found that these env files are built in when the app builds, and so I do in fact have both versions running, and I'll show you how. I'll show it to you, prove it to you, and then show you how it works. One of the ways I'm able to run both at once is that they're targeting two different iPhones. So the way that was kind of just by serendipity that happened. When you configure Detox, you specify the name of the simulator to run on. And I chose iPhone 8 because that was the newest iPhone that was not a 10, and I don't have an iPhone 10, and so it makes me feel inadequate when I see the simulator running an iPhone that I don't have. So I wanted to run the iPhone 8, so that's what I did. So I set up Detox to run the iPhone 8. I didn't explicitly set which iPhone simulator to run regular React Native running in, but it turns out that it went to the iPhone 6 simulator, and that works out great. So now my manual testing running of the app that's going to hit the real server is going to run in the iPhone 6, and Detox will run in the iPhone 8. So just to reload to show it working, I can reload in here, and I see here this says this is a restaurant from the server. We'll play around with that some more to show the data that's saved to the server in a little bit. And then this is the version that runs off of Detox, off of that fake fake backend. So the fake backend just has a Burger Place as the default restaurant. So if we reload this, we see that Burger Place is there, and we can run the Detox test. Let's run that real quick just to make sure. It's going to take a second just to start up. And it goes, oh, what has happened? Oh, this is the old error where the keyboard is not showing up. So whenever that happens, you just manually show the keyboard and rerun it, and hope that doesn't happen too many times. It's only, in my testing, in our stream here, hasn't happened twice in a row, I don't think. So yeah, so the Detox test is running just fine, and it's running against our test backend, so that this is not going to clutter up our actual dev server. So now we're set up for the Detox automated testing. We have Jest component testing, which of course doesn't hit a server because it's just running the components individually. And then we have our manual testing as an option as well. So one other thing that's important when you're running this is to understand what the different React Native build commands do. Because which of these .env files is included happens at build time when your iOS binary happens. So that file is not included with the JavaScript bundle that's sent down. It's included with the iOS binary that's built. So if you run React Native, run iOS, what this is going to do is it's going to rebuild and upload the iOS binary to the simulator that you're using for production. So this will rerun. It'll use the default env file and be good to go. Then if you run detox build, we actually configured that in our package.json file. Detox build is going to run this build command, and this includes an env command to specify the env file to the detox env file. Then when you run detox test, it's going to, detox test, that's going to install it on your test simulator, specified here, iPhone 8. It's going to upload that binary and run the tests. So here's an important thing to note. If you run React Native run iOS, let me type it out, run iOS, that's going to build the development version of the app with the development config file. And if right after that you run detox test, that's not going to rebuild the binary in the test version. That's just going to deploy the dev version of the binary to your test device and try to automate it. So that's going to result in your tests running against your development server, and that's not what you want. So just remember, if you're switching back and forth to run detox build before you run detox test, Another thing you can do is when you run detox test -r, that's not going to re-upload the binary at all. That's just going to restart the binary that's already on your test device, your test simulator, and go from there. So with those things in place, it might take you a little fiddling, but with those things in place, you can run development mode and test mode. And now there's finally a reason to not just do manual testing in the same simulator as Detox, because you might want to actually hit the real dev server. And so when we're done today, we're going to kind of do some manual testing to confirm our app is working the way we expect. So that's some setup for getting the real and test backends working together. And now we're going to go on to our final feature. Not the final feature to get the app fully working, but the final feature that's going to illustrate something new about testing for the sake of this stream. And what that is we have the data being read properly from the server, but we want to save the data to the server as well, and that's not happening. So if we go in here, do new restaurant, and save it, we would want that to be saved to the server. But if we reload the app, we see that isn't saved to the backend API. It's just the one restaurant we had set up beforehand. So we want to get that saving working. And we can see that in our store class. Yeah. Oh, so I realize this is actually not great naming here. Oh no, there it is. Yeah, APIs are in this API folder. And then there's our store folder that has our MobX stores, including the restaurant store. So this is the root level of our data here. We have the load all method that connects to the API and gets the restaurant's route to load the restaurants. And then we stick them in our in MobX store here locally so they're available to the app. But then we see down here where we have the add restaurant method, we just push them into the local array. We don't save them back to the server. And so that's what we want to do now. So now we want to talk about how to test drive this feature. You may recall that last time we were test driving the reading of the data, there was an obvious way, once we thought about it, obvious to me at least, way to do the test. And what this is that we wanted to test that when we start the app, an initial restaurant is available that's returned from the server. And so we created a new test called confirm initial restaurant present, and this just confirmed that Burger Place is available when the app first starts up. So what could we do at an end-to-end test level to assert that the value is saved? We're already asserting that the new restaurant we create is shown in the app and is interactable. So what would we do to confirm that it was saved to the server? Well, I suppose it might be possible to intercept those requests going out and monitor them. Maybe some of y'all that are watching this have done that. That'd be very cool. But at a surface level, from my experience level so far, there's not an obvious way to do it. If anything, we might need to just kind of restart the app and confirm that at that point, given that the store data was still there, but the app was restarted, that it would in fact return the new restaurant that was created. That feels pretty heavyweight, and that unless you really need that for your app, that breaks with the Detox convention of reloading the app just once at the start of your test. So I've decided we're not going to go with that, and instead what we're going to do is we're just going to drive this feature out at the unit test level. And this provides just a way to talk through and think through that circumstance. Not everything needs to be tested at the end-to-end test level. You may recall in the past, some of our edge cases and error cases we have tested at the component level rather than at the end-to-end test level. And so we're going to do the same thing for the store here. And the fact that we have manual testing that we can do, we'll be able to test to make sure the data is actually saved up to there. So let's kind of go into that and see. Let's look here. We have the restaurant store. So this is our main class again where this data is stored. We tested our load all method and it checked that it returns restaurants from the API. We created a fake API object here that would return a promise that was going to resolve from the get method with the data that we wanted. And so now we're going to be able to use, when we add a restaurant, we're going to actually be able to set up an API as well. And instead of returning data, we're going to be using a just mock function to confirm that the data was sent out properly. We're using a just mock function or a... Yeah, that's right. I remember I've gone back and forth as far as which test runner we've been using. I think that I shifted our end-to-end test from Jest to Mocha, but our unit tests are still using Jest, and so it's going to be a Jest mock function that we're using. And we've used those elsewhere. So let's go ahead and start pseudocoding this, and then we'll fill it out as we go. So as we add a restaurant, we want to confirm that it adds a new restaurant instance to the restaurant list. I think what we're going to do, we want to specify an additional thing that add restaurant does. So we'll just create it as a separate test right now, and we'll afterwards we'll refactor out some duplication. So we want to say that add restaurant also posts the new restaurant to the API. Yes, we want to assert the call post the new restaurant to the API. All right, so what are we going to do here? Let's manually type stuff over to make sure that we're not inappropriately duplicating things. We do want a name for the restaurant. Sushi Place. Probably remove that duplication later. New restaurant store, because we're going to be calling this method on the restaurant store. So we're going to call store.addRestaurant. And now what are we going to expect? I think we want to have an API.post to have been called with, and I think that's the jest syntax. I use Mocha day to day and sign on for test doubles, but I think this is the syntax. We'll find out. Maruko is hosting me. I think I know what hosting is now. I'm still pretty new to streaming, but thank you, Maruko. So we want an API post to have been called. So what is the data we want to send up to the server? Well, as you may recall, that we're using has it gone away? It has gone away. We're using my sandbox API to store our data. So that's where it is. It uses JSON API format to store this data. And we haven't documented the restaurants in here, but we have documented this other thing here. And I think I know enough about JSON API to be able to put it in. Let's make a variable called const expected body, just to kind of make it a bit clearer what we're doing. We'll say this has been called with expected body. And we'll come back to define that mock function later. So the body is going to have data. And actually, no, that's right, we have to pass a URL as well. So the first thing is, post is going to be called, and it's going to be called to restaurants with the expected body. Okay, so we're following the JSON API format here. So we pass a data property, and in there we have a type field. The type is restaurants plural. I really need to come up with an example that I can spell better than restaurants, or do spelling katas or something like that. So we're specifying that the data here has a type of restaurants. We don't have an ID for it yet because we're creating it, but it does have attributes. More specifically, it has one attribute, which is going to be the name of the restaurant, and that name is just going to be the name we have up here, so we'll just kind of use that brief syntax to fill that in. So we want to confirm that API.post is called with, we're posting to the URL restaurants with this expected body as part of it. And this is what we can be assured of. We'll manually test it, but at a unit component testing level, if we call this, if this happens, if this outgoing call from the store happens, then we're good, we're done. That's the responsibility of the restaurant store itself, is to call the appropriate method on the API. So let's save this. I assume it's going to fail quite spectacularly, so let's save it and find out. Yeah, so API is not even defined. I'm still got something wrong with my linter setup here, because I would really like to have that indicated to me by the linter that that's not defined. So let's set it up. Up here, we set up the API as the first thing we did. So API is going to be an object, and that object is going to have a post property in it, and that's going to be jest.fn, a jest function or a jest mock function. We used those earlier, but you can read about those on the jest mock functions page. A jest mock function, or like other kind of mock functions or test doubles, is a function that can receive calls and will keep track of the calls made on it, so you can do things like run this expectation to see what it was called with. So now we have API, and we have API.post, so let's run it and see what happens. I expect this to fail because it's not being called. Here we go, and jest output is really nice. So we expected the mock function to have been called with restaurants in the data, but it was not called. So that's great. That's great that it was not called, because we have not called it yet. And so we're going to get it called now. And so let's do that. We're going to open up the restaurant store. You see, because we've already set up the API integration into the restaurant store, we have an API field on the class. And so we're just going to call it in here. I'm just going to put it at the end of the function for right now, and then we'll refactor it in the end when we're done. I think we don't even need to make it an async function yet. So this.api.post. Let's be strict here and say that the error just says it was not called. And so let's see what happens if we just call it with no arguments sent. Let's try to get past just this one error. We save, we rerun. Cannot read the property post of undefined. Okay, this probably has to do with the initialization of our store in the test. Yep, and sure enough, we pass in API up here, but we don't pass it in here. So we need to pass that into the store. This should get us past this error, and we'll see what the next error is. All right, here we go. So now it says that we expected a string but to receive undefined. We expected this function to have been called. We expected the arguments to be Okay, here we go. It's split it out as two different differences. It's expecting argument 1 to be restaurants, but it was undefined, and expecting argument 2 to be this data structure, but it was undefined as well. So we can actually do both of these at once, so let's do that. So we're going to post the data as 2 restaurants, and our API object has our server name and authentication defined, so we're good to go there. Cool. So I just remembered that I haven't updated the authentication in this app since several weeks ago when we ran, but I set up our server side to have those tokens never expire, so it may not be the most secure thing in the world, but that works out well for us here, so that's nice. All right, so we're going to post to restaurants, and we're going to send that data in. So up in our load all method, we didn't need to define the JSON data structure here, other than just know that it was under data.data to get the data there. We needed to do a little bit. We needed to take the restaurant data and retrieve the name out of the attributes name field. So, but here we're going to have to do a bit more. We're going to have to kind of actually replicate that JSON data structure, so that's fine. So we have data in here, type rest. Let's do single quote, because that's how my linter is set up. And we'll do attributes. Name. Oh, and the name will just kind of, it's the name and the value there, so that should be good. As a reminder, like last time, so this data structure we've typed in just like we've typed it in over here. So this doesn't give us any confidence that the data structure the server wants actually matches with this. And that is totally okay, because that is not the goal of this test. The goal of this test is just the contract for restaurant store, or the inputs and the outputs it should send given the inputs. And this is what we're asserting is the case here. In fact, any end-to-end tests here that are not actually hitting the server are going to need to be mocking things out. And so you won't get the real confidence from the automated test that you're actually working with the server unless you automate that. And generally, it's not a great idea to have automated tests that are going to always run and fail your build to hit an external server. So I'd recommend saving that for manual testing. Maybe one automated smoke test, and I'd recommend sticking with a standard like JSON API or maybe GraphQL, something that's nice and standard so you don't have to have a whole lot of uncertainty and concern about the contract between your client and your server. So let's test this implementation. I think this may very well get our test to pass. Oh, we did not get it. All right, here. Add restaurant. Okay, cool. Let's check it out. Jest output is nice and clear for us. We expected it to be called with name sushi place, but it was called with name undefined. So maybe I'm not passing in name properly here. That's probably true. Yep, sure enough, I'm not passing name in, and that's okay. We'll make that change in the test to get it to happen. All right, now we cannot read property post of undefined. Interesting. I thought we defined that. We have API. We set up a post property. I mean, it's not even saying that post isn't defined. It says that API is not defined. So C. McAvoy says, I love Jest. Great logging. I agree. In my limited experience with Jest, that's one of the things I'm most excited about, and kind of one of the things I get most frustrated about Mocha and Chai about is when the test output is harder to follow. I often end up having to console log json.stringify to see what exactly the data was, to see what was not matching. So Jest output here is really, really nice. I agree. So, and now this is good, because now we got to figure out what's going on here, because the test output is great, but I don't know what I've written wrong in the test here. If you're on the chat and you can notice what I've done wrong, please let me know. So we're in the restaurant store, we're calling this.api, and this.api was used up here as well. So in the constructor it was called. Seems like it would work. We could always log it out. We create new restaurant store passing the API. Let's just log it out here. Console.log this.api. The API is... So let's see how that works. Restaurant store line 22. So that's interesting. It's like it's calling it on that line twice. Have I not saved the changes here? Oh, I see what's happening here. So check it out. So up in this branch of the test, this add restaurant test, we are not defining the API there. And so the test is this test is actually failing. I think this one is passing and this one is failing. Yeah, there are two calls because there's two different tests that are running here. Now I think what I can do, because we're in a single file here, I think I can use .only here to run just this one test, and then we'll fix the other failing test in a moment. But let's just do this just to increase our assurance that this individual test is passing. And it says 4 passed and 3 skipped, so I think that's good. We can remove this console log. Yeah, okay, cool. So that means this test is passing. So now, when we call add restaurant, passing in the name, we can see that the call to API post is in fact being done. Now before we go on, just because we saw that error, let's go back out and fix that problem in the other test before we do any other refactoring. So we're just going to add in this test. Only is a bit of a misnomer here, because if only is on 2 tests, they're both going to run. And so we should now see one passed and one fail. Yes, so check it out here. Cannot read property post of undefined. This is in when we're testing that add restaurant adds a new restaurant instance to the restaurant list. So our setup here is incorrect. So I could go ahead and extract the setup to a before each block, but just to be safe and just to take steps slow, I'm going to actually move it up here, move the API setup up here, and pass the API in here and see if this gets it passing, just so that null is fixed. So we're fixed and we're good to go. So let's take off these onlys to make sure our whole component and unit test suite passes, and it does. So now we definitely have duplication amongst these tests. We had to do some setup here that wasn't even necessary for what we care about in this individual test with our nice focused test assertion. So that's a great candidate to move stuff out at the top. I definitely want to set up the API object with its post differently each time, and so I'm going to do that in a before each block as well. So let's just remove duplication one at a time. First we'll do let API to create an API variable up there. We'll do a before each. And in here, we'll set up API. We don't have to restore the mock or anything because we can just overwrite it. It's not wrapping any existing functionality, so we can just overwrite it. And I believe now, with this change, our test should still pass. So as a reminder, in test-driven development in general, there's a red-green refactor process. So when you go red, you write a failing test, as we did. Then you go green to get the test to pass in the simplest way possible. And then you refactor to improve your production code or improve your test. And we are going to need to go back to the production code in a minute, so hopefully I won't forget that. Remind me in the chat if I forget that. So right now we're refactoring our test first. So what other duplication can we move out? Well, the name here is just a constant string, and we don't change it at all, so that can be moved out just fine. We just need some kind of name value that we could use for the test assertions as well. And sure enough, that works just fine. And in our case here, setting up the store, we actually don't need to do any different setup in either of the cases. In fact, the error we got was that the setup needed to be the same. So we'll just create a store variable here. We're going to assign to it here, and we've got our API ready and available here to assign into it. And so then now, down here, we'll be good. So I've actually heard different views on this. One way to think about your test is that there's 3 steps. There's arrange, act, assert, or given, when, then. So first we're arranging the variables we need, and then we're saying we're going to act. We're going to call add restaurant, which we can see happens twice here. And then we assert different things, which we're doing separately here, because one has to do with state of the variable that's of the store that's set available, and one has to do with an external message that's sent to the API. Some folks would argue that your act step should always be down in individual steps, and that before each should only be used for arranging. But another way to go is to say if you have the same act step, then that can be moved up as well. So let's just try that and visualize that as well. In this case, there's nothing different we need to do. We're always calling add restaurant in just the same way. And now it's just the assertions or the expectations that are different. And our tests still pass. And I think that's totally fine in this case. So that's really good, and so we're going to have our arrange and our act steps up in here, and we're good to go. And now I think our test is in great shape. We say that when we call add restaurant on the store, 2 things should happen. It should add a new restaurant instance to the restaurant list, and it should post the new restaurant to the API. Cool, so now let's go back and look at our store. Right now, I've actually been thinking about the arrangement of like local and remote data, because I'm thinking about playing around with some content around store layers and remote access and things like that. So I've been thinking about this. So we have here a push that happens on this array synchronously, just in memory, and then afterwards on the same thread, we call this API post. Because we're using Axios and expecting to follow the Axios conventions, this is going to return a promise, and we're actually not returning that anywhere out of add restaurant. And so I forget if anywhere else in our application is relying on that promise to be returned. I doubt it is, but let's check and see. I think this is probably in our restaurant list. When we handle add restaurant, Yeah, we do this. Yeah, so we just call add restaurant. We don't care about a return promise or not. So that's fine. So we won't make a change there arbitrarily to change the return value. But I think what I will do, so there's two different ways we could do this. We could push the data locally here right away and have it show up locally regardless of whether the remote call succeeds or fails. And that's kind of called optimistic UI, where you assume the request to the server succeeds and you go ahead and update the local UI. You can also have a pessimistic UI, which is going to wait for that remote request to complete before it updates. And so let's just try that right now and see how the effects that would have on our test. And because we don't have any error handling in our app right now, actually, this might actually be a little bit safer. So we're going to have this API post. We're going to change this to use async await because I like that and we've been using it so far. We don't need to do a response at this point. All we need to do is to wait for that promise to resolve, and then we're going to push this onto here. And really, this ensures that it succeeds, that it resolves, not that it doesn't reject. So this is going to put async and await. This is going to wait to push until after this promise resolves. So I think I may have realized something that would need to change in our test in these circumstances. So let's go ahead and do it. This is good. We rerun the test. Cool, and it actually fails. Jetty says it's nice to see you're a glass half full kind of guy. Cool, I forget which statement I've made that refers to because I've been rambling so much. So feel free to clarify or just let me have this positivity and feel good about it. So speaking of positivity, we have a failing test, so that's wonderful. Maybe it was all those wonderful comments here. So we add a new restaurant instance to the restaurant list. We expected something. We expected what? Store restaurant's length to equal 1, but it was actually 0. And so what this is saying here is, we're calling add restaurant, and then we're expecting the length to equal 1. And the reason that it's not is because we're waiting for this asynchronous operation to complete before we push it locally. And so if we want to stay with this pessimistic UI approach, what we're going to do is change our test to be asynchronous as well. I think what we can do, and this is going to be a little abstract. This is not primarily a tutorial on asynchronous tests. Maybe I could do that some other time. But I think what will happen, and we might just give up in a few minutes. We'll see. I think what will happen is if I return this from here, a couple things need to happen. So this as an async method, using async and await, this method by default is going to return a promise. And if the app makes it through all the way until when this succeeds, then the promise returned out of this method will resolve. And so, I think if we return that promise out of here, then that's just is going to wait for that to finish before it goes on to our tests. And so I think we'll be good. So I don't know. We'll run it. We'll find out together. And sure enough, it passes. And so this relates to kind of the indirect nature of async await tests, or asynchronous testing. Like, it's complex. Asynchronous applications are complex. So it's not totally obvious why just this random return statement we've added has fixed this, but it has. So that's something helpful to think about. So with this, I think this is good. I like the way our application code works out here. This seems a bit safer to wait for this request to finish before we do anything else. So I think we're good. So let's go ahead and commit our changes here for this unit test. We'll review them. We see that add restaurant has become an async function. We are making this post to the API, and we're awaiting the response before we do that pushing that we were doing before. Let's split up the results here. Now in restaurant, we do a bunch of setup at the start. And outside of the test, we don't have any mutable state here that could be changed by individual tests to make them collide with one another. We do our resetting of our state in the before each block. So that's all fine. We actually do the arranging and the acting. And then we add an it around this one test here. It adds a new restaurant instance to the restaurant list. So that's one of the things we're checking. That's what we were checking before. The additional checking is that we're confirming that we posted the new restaurant to the API. So that's good too. So we're going to commit that. It's like post added restaurant to server. And as usual, we've made a new branch to make these changes on. Person CYLV Twitch 2 says, do you only test your public functions or also your private ones? That's a great question. I take a testing approach that tends to, if there was a function that I needed to test that was private, I would probably expose it publicly so that I could do the testing. But really, I think a better way to say what I think about is, when I'm thinking about a class or even thinking about a module, I would think about testing the public contract of that unit of code, what it exposes to the rest of the app. And so if there were private functions, like for example, if there were private helper functions in the restaurant store class to help it do its job, I wouldn't test those directly. I would test those through the external interface. And I would say, okay, well, it doesn't matter what the implementation details inside the class are of those private functions, but just externally, I need to get the behavior out of this class or out of this module that I need. And then I want to write enough tests of the external behavior of the class to drive out all those internal helpers that I need. Now, this is one of the things that allows you to avoid coupling to implementation. And so this means you could start out without an internal private helper function, and then you can refactor it later to add that private helper function in. And your unit tests won't change because they won't break because they're testing just the external functionality of the class. I was listening to a podcast with Kent C. Dodds and some other folks the other day where someone brought up a good question about cases where this might not be the case, like if you are testing confirming which of two algorithms were used internally to the class depending on certain conditions, and that's not externally visible. So in that case, what I might do is split up the function or the class into separate functions or classes and test them individually, and then I might pass in like a mock functions for each of those algorithms to see what was called out to. And so in that way, I'm deciding what to expose as independent public modules or classes and testing each of them as a unit. So I hope that answers your question. Feel free to follow up on chat or another time. That's great questions that I'd love to dig into. And for you, you may find your needs are different, but that's the approach that I've generally tried to take. Cool, so we've committed our unit test here, and now it should be going and connecting to the server. Now we can test that manually. Before we do that, I want to test, I want to end-to-end test, I want to run our detox tests. I'm not totally sure, but I think they might fail because we might need to implement something new in them. Our detox tests aren't going to give us full assurance that everything works, but they may fail to show us that at least something at the end-to-end testing level is broken. We'll find out. Yep, we got an error. Let's see what it was. There's that long... In newer versions of detox, the test output has actually gotten longer, so it seems like it's gotten longer before it gets shorter. Okay, so this is saying that we can't find the UI element. So that restaurant we tried to add has not, in fact, been added. So I think I know what's happening, but I want to get the React Native debugger working. You may notice my awesome color theme in here now. I'm a Firefox person, so I've now set up Chrome to warn me with the UI whenever I'm using it, so I don't accidentally use it. Also, Chrome has that new design that looks like Firefox. So let's rerun our test here and see what happens. See if the debugger gives us clearer output. Okay, unhandled promise rejection. This API post is not a function. And this is what I thought would happen. We're faking out in the end-to-end test layer, we're faking out our API in a different way. And so we haven't added the post support in there as well. So let's go into that. This is in our store. We have our fake store here. And we can see here that there is a get function. There's not a post function. So we'll add a post method here. I say function and method interchangeably because those things are looser in JavaScript. It's not like Ruby where everything's a method. We'll add this in, and so this should actually be enough. This empty post should actually be enough to get the test to pass. So let's run that and see. It's at least going to get us past this error for sure, so that's good. Restaurant name comes in, save it, restaurant shows up. Have the dish, we go back, we double check that it's still, oh, we didn't navigate back in. I wonder why that is. That seems unrelated. That seems like something flaky. Multiple UI elements matched. Interesting. Yeah, I don't think that's related. I think that's something else. Let's find out. CYLV, I see your question. No, that's a great question. I think that relates to the way we've set up some of the code already. And so, yeah, I'm not sure. This end-to-end test failure, this might be something else that's going on that's too tricky for me to do on the stream, so I might need to look into that afterwards. Oh, you know what? I think I know what it is. We're not returning a promise. That's what it is. So yeah, the test output is not helping us with that. Return promise resolve. So let's do that. Let's see if that does it. If not, I may need to defer this and look into it later. Yeah, let me stay focused on this passing, and then I'll answer your question. CYLV. This is great. Jetty's got thoughts too. This is good discussion. That's what I'm hoping to get to. All right, so something has still failed. This is related to multiple UI elements matched. So usually when that happens with Detox, it means that it still has another screen in memory somehow. And so it's getting confused as to which is which. And so that's probably what's going on. There's some trickiness there. I'll have to use some scoping to my matchers to be able to get that working. So I'll do that offline. All right, let's take a look at these questions now. Yeah, so here we go. CYLV says, what do you do if, let's say you have a library or API that you're using and you don't exactly know how the data manipulation works with that library? How do you go about doing that? Most of the time when I'm trying to get into TDD, that's the time where I stop doing it because it seems so difficult. So that's a great question. So I think it depends on what you're using the code for. So one example would be a utility library like Lodash. If you're using something like Lodash to manipulate objects or arrays or things like that, I would just use it directly. I would use it in your code, and then just let your tests of your external your classes and your functions work and make sure that they're doing what's desired. So the test would actually run through Lodash's code as well. And you'd be good to go. The other extreme is connecting to external web services like this, where I recommend not connecting to like these other servers that run independently of your React Native or your JavaScript application, but instead creating this faking layer. And you can hear more about that in the recording of last week's episode, which I can share on the chat a little bit later, so you can get to that easily, or you can just check it out on my YouTube channel, where we talk about a fake and what it's useful for. But in general, what we've done is we created this interface just called store. We said, okay, we're going to have a store and we're going to define what it is. And so in our application code, then we can test against it. In our unit test, we can kind of create individual objects here that are returning what we needed, fake data, or monitoring the input or the output. But in our case, we didn't need to create a custom interface for it. We just followed what Axios follows. So we're not actually using Axios as a web service library in our tests or wrapping it or anything like that, but we are following the API it provides. So if you follow somewhere in the middle, like maybe you have something like a data storage library, you're storing something to local storage or something more complex like that, and you'd say like in TDD, like how would you make it work? I think this is not going to be a full answer that's going to cover everything, but I think what I would do, and I think in an earlier screencast, I followed an approach called spiking. This is when we were going through the MobX library, and I had like a low level of confidence that I understood how it worked. And so before I did like unit level tests or anything like that, I spiked it. I went through, we were under an end-to-end test at that point, but not unit level tests. And I was just seeing how it worked and fixing bugs and problems as they came up. And then when I was done, then I went back through and unit tested it. And so in the same way, when you're working with a new library, and when I work with a new library, I don't go right into testing. I will play around with it without any tests and see how it works. And once I'm satisfied that I understand it, then I might say, okay, I'm going to come back now, and now I'm going to test drive my features. And another thing I might do is I might use this kind of wrapping approach to hide my application from that code if it's connecting to external databases, or maybe it's connecting to device async storage, React Native's async storage library, and that's messy. I don't want my test to get to it. So I guess it's like, if it's running in memory, I would probably include it in my test and have it all run through. But if it's connecting to some kind of external resource like a web service or device storage, I might wrap it so that my automated tests don't run through that layer. I think that's related to Juddy's questions. Let me see. But CYLV, feel free to ask follow-ups on the chat, and either now or afterwards, I can follow up with you and we can discuss in more detail, I feel like. So Juddy says he wants to clarify something, and I can leave it for later if I like. Nope, I'm going to do it now, at least until I change my mind. You said that relying on external APIs in your tests is not desirable. You're meaning integration level tests, right? Not end-to-end? If you don't use your server API and say an end-to-end test of authentication, how do you have confidence that that piece works? That's perfect, Juddy. That is a great question. So this is tricky. This is one of the trickiest tests of end-to-end testing. And it's certainly possible to connect to, it's easier to connect to these external APIs in your tests. You just don't go through the faking exercise that we went through last week. And so for you or for any others that are listening, if you're already doing end-to-end tests that are connecting to an external web service and it's working reliable for you, then that's great. Like, go for it. Like, you know the constraints you're under. For a while on an Apple TV app that I was doing, I did set up automated testing hitting an external service. And this was because it was changing a fair amount of time. And so we wanted to get knowledge back without... I wanted to get results from tests back that said, hey, this in the web service changed, and not have some error that looked like it was an error in our application code that would hide the result of the failure. So we started out with those tests as automated tests that ran as part of our suite. But what we found is, first we found that they were kind of slow. So our unit tests, and this was a tvOS app, end-to-end testing was challenging there, but all of our other tests that ran within the application were very fast, but these tests that were hitting the external API were very slow. So first it slowed us down, and so that was kind of frustrating, but it was okay. The next thing that happened is that they started to be flaky. So there could be a connectivity error, like the external API could be down. And so at that point we set them up, moved them into a separate test suite, so that when I was running my unit tests locally for the stuff I was working on, I didn't need to rerun the test of the external web service all the time. So we separated that out. I think we might have run the test on continuous integration for our unit test, but not the test that hit the external API. Because, the good thing is that those tests would catch when the external API changed, but the bad thing is my tests would now start failing when somebody else's code changed. And so you do want to know that, right? But the thing that can cause a problem is if you start to lose confidence in your tests, because if something genuine changed on the third-party API or the external API, then that's good to know and you can update your code. But say it has an outage every once in a while, or say you're trying to run your tests locally and you don't have an internet connection, or there's just something finicky on the setup of your continuous integration server. So if then your end-to-end tests start failing because of connectivity to this web service, that can be frustrating. That can end up resulting in problems. It can end up resulting in your team not trusting your end-to-end tests, or just getting into the habit of rerunning them every time they fail instead of trusting that they're showing you a real problem. So I recommend folks starting lighter on automating any tests towards external systems. If you think you're going to catch it in manual testing of running through your app, then maybe that's just fine. Other than that, you might have just like one single smoke test just to confirm that the main thing that you're hitting on that external API is working, and that may be good enough. So try it out and see. Those are the trade-offs and the constraints, so it's definitely tricky when it comes to testing external web services, but that's some of the factors that I take into account. So, hope that was helpful. Sweet. All right, so we're gonna violate all of our TDD desires, and we're gonna ignore this detox end-to-end test right now. And we'll see. We're gonna do a manual test here. So I want to see. Remember, when we started this out, our app was not actually saving our new restaurants to the server. So let's actually try to do that now and see if it works. Restaurant I added literally right now. We'll call it that, and we got to get the capitalization right. So let's save that restaurant, and it does not show up. It says unhandled promise rejection. Okay, so this is good. This is actually hitting the real server, and so there's something that I've set up incorrectly. So let's see what we can figure out there. I think I need to detach the debugger from my detox server, and then maybe we can attach it to my non-detox one. And let's add a restaurant. So see now that, to actually connect to the server, we need to do a manual test here, and this is where this is happening. Okay, status code 415. So I do wish that React Native by default was showing this. I bet you I could, do some error handling that I actually should have been doing in the first place and put that in here. Maybe this won't go into the test, but so maybe we'll do, with async and await, you can do a try and catch. So let's log out that error here, and then we'll just rethrow the error. Let's rerun this. Request failed with status code 415. Great. Well, I think I can actually, just from previous messing around, I think I can say message here. Maybe that was the message. So let's see. Our manual testing is going to figure out this integration. Yep, that's not good enough. So let's do what I was saying before, json.stringify. And this should turn all the fields on it into a string, and hopefully that'll give us the actual response we get back. XSRF token. Oh, no, that's not necessarily the problem. Oh, cool, here we go. All right. Here's the error. Unsupported. So this is unfortunate that this is very tedious here. But here's the error here. Unsupported media type. All requests that create or update must use the application vnd.api plus JSON content type. And so this is something that I run into all the time because when I'm not using JSON API specification servers, I don't get this error. But then JSON API is specific and requires this. So this is, you might think that I planned this, but I did not plan this because I'm not that smart. But this is great to illustrate that it's like, our unit tests were passing, our end-to-end test locally in Detox was a little weird, but I think it would have passed once we got that working. But we want to actually manually test to hit the real server to find this out because our tests were not going to catch that. And what I'm saying is in this testing approach, that's okay. Like you want to actually manually hit the server to get these errors back to find out what's happening. And hopefully your server is consistent enough that once you fix this once, you're good to go. So I'm glad this came up. We can actually set this as one of the headers in our API here as we're configuring Axios, and we can just say content type. I can never remember the order here. Application vnd.api plus JSON. So this is now setting up our API here. So I bet, well, anything else might go wrong, but I bet you at least that will be passed now. Okay, cool. So now this says that it's saved AAA here. I'm actually glad again, more fortunateness. I'm glad that we played things cautiously and we did not have the restaurant update in the UI until the remote response changed because the failure happened better. We were able to see it a bit better thanks to React Native's built-in reporting of an unhandled exception because otherwise we wouldn't have been able to see what was going on. So now, I think based on the fact that an error did not come back from this, that this was saved to the server, but I don't know. So we're going to reload and find out if it comes up. We reload, and AAA, the server comes up. It's not as beautiful a restaurant name as I would have had in the first place, but it indicates the quick and dirty nature of our development here. All right, what does Jody have to say? More referring to a backend that you set up as part of your system rather than something external. Yeah, that's definitely a big difference. I would be more likely to, let's say this, I would be more likely to have an automated test hit an external dev server that I control than a third-party one like Google or MailChimp or something like that. No offense, MailChimp. But in the case that the application I was working on, we were external consultants working with the organization, so we didn't have as direct contact. Even though it was an internal API run by the organization, it was another team in the organization. We didn't have great quick turnaround time if there was an outage. He was not available for communication right away. So yeah, that's a great distinction, Juddy. I'm distracted by your joke about 418 teapot. Yeah, I feel like that's like a Monty Python level of humor where it's like it's great, it's hilarious, and then like it keeps coming up again and again. Although I think it's swung back around. I think I find Monty Python and the Holy Grail funny again because it's just been so long. It's been cliche for a while, and now it's funny again. So we've now set up our test. Let's rerun that unit test to make sure it works. Pending this problem here with the detox test that I'm going to look into later. So let's commit with the changes we found here. So let's add this, add error logging for web service error. That's nice to keep that, I think. Add post method for fake server for E2E tests to get those to pass. And then we add, JSON API content type to get real server connection working. So that's actually interesting that we saw this working at 3 levels. In a unit test of our store, we were just kind of directly defining an API object here. In our end-to-end test, we were using a fake API, and then our manual testing, we were connecting to the real API. And that feels like a lot, but that's there for a reason. So I think we're approaching the end. That was good. So now it's time to reflect. It's time to think and reflect. This has been a number of weeks. Not all of you have been here for all of the weeks, and so I want to look back at what we've accomplished. I would call this a vertical slice of testing the app, where we've gone through and iteratively over time, we've tested a whole bit of functionality where we're able to get The restaurants, we did create new dishes as well, but we did not yet connect those to the server side. You could do that as a part of an exercise for the viewer if you wanted to. But let's run through it and look through what we accomplished. And so now this is kind of going to demonstrate some testing that we might want to have in an app. Even if you didn't test drive it, even if you wrote these tests afterwards, this might still be the same level of approach you might take for testing. So let's walk through it and see. So we have end-to-end tests implemented with Detox. Right now we have one just called Managing Restaurants. We have just a single if statement in here, and this is because in our end-to-end tests we're following the, what was the name of that? A feature tour aspect, where we walk through, in a single test, we walk through a sequence. And this is because end-to-end tests are slow, and so we don't want things to slow down inordinately. Even in working in a very small application like this, I started to get frustrated by the slow speed of end-to-end tests. Now that might be less of a problem if you're doing tests afterwards, but if you're doing test-driven development, you're going to want to run those end-to-end tests quickly as you go. So we just have one test here that runs through this series of steps, and it's confirming that some initial data is loaded when we come into our app. Then it's creating a restaurant, doing things like tapping on things, clicking on buttons, confirming that things are not visible, and then confirming that other things are visible on the screen. So our end-to-end test, as is typical for Detox, is just confirming what the end user can see as they're interacting with their app. I guess that was create dish instead of create restaurant. But the steps are very similar. We're looking for things on the screen, interacting with them. And that's what's happening in our end-to-end test. Then down at our unit level test, we don't feel the need to unit test everything, especially not in our components, but we'll test what matters. So let's see here. We have a restaurant and dish list, and then we have modals for both of them. In our test here for components, you see that we did not end up unit testing our list components at all. And they're not trivial. I mean, there's state in them, there's stuff going on, but that felt like there was the end-to-end test covered this functionality enough that we didn't need to have a unit test for them as well. You could make a different choice. You could say, hey, as soon as I'm implementing this list component, I want to unit test that as well. That could be very fair. You could definitely do that if you want. But I felt like the end-to-end test covered those enough that we didn't need to do that at a unit level. Now the modals, on the other hand, involving forms for creating restaurant and dishes, those are substantial enough that I wanted to test those. And so for the add restaurant modal, for example, we're using Enzyme for testing, because Enzyme works on React Native, just in this shallow approach. So if you're used to Enzyme on the web using mounting, shallow, at least as of the last that I checked, was the only approach that worked, because this JavaScript just running directly in Jest, not on a device, doesn't have the real React Native APIs working. So what we can do here is we can use JSX to define this component, we can pass properties into it, and then we can check for certain things in the component. We're looking for test IDs, which I actually also used in the end-to-end test, I believe. Yeah, when you're using, in Detox, when you're using element by ID, that's looking for test IDs in React Native, which correspond to accessibility IDs on iOS. So we're using those same test IDs in here. We're just checking a component props to see if its test ID matches what was passed in. And we're using that to find buttons, press them. We're going to change text. But you see, even then, even the concept of simulate change text is a bit lower level than type. So we're kind of thinking about the interactions with the component at a lower level. We're confirming that some validation errors were cleared out. We're confirming that upon submit, we do the functionality. We confirm that the text field is cleared out. It was a little tricky for us to figure out how to validate that. I remember that being fancy. And we confirm that validation errors are cleared again. And we confirm that the onSave handler was called. So this was the other place we were using Jest mock functions, was the interface for an individual component, the output that it might send might be a call to a passed-in function. So that's what we were testing at that level. This add restaurant modal component isn't responsible for anything to happen in the store. It's just responsible to call the passed-in function that we did. And you'll notice that this, I think this component test is a lot longer than our end-to-end test. Let's count the lines. Our end-to-end test for the whole app is only 47 lines long, but this component test is already 150 lines long. And that's great. I'm glad that worked out that way, because that illustrates the approach I tend to take it's the test pyramid. It's fewer end-to-end tests and more unit tests. We tested more edge cases. I don't even think we tested the validation message at the end-to-end test level, because that would be slow. And so being able to test it at the unit test level, we got quick feedback. Our test suite, as our app got bigger and bigger, as we experienced more and more success, our test suite would continue to run quickly. And again, if you find that something's causing you a problem, it's causing you pain not to have something in an end-to-end test, consider moving it into there. But I'd really encourage you to consider small end-to-end tests that are fully covering your app, but the main cases, like the happy paths and like maybe a major error case, and test all the edge cases, all the details down at the component testing level. The other thing we component tested was our store layer. We looked at using MobX to implement stores that were simple classes and simple JavaScript objects that allowed us just to do things like store.loadAll and store.addRestaurant. The store exposed an array of restaurants, and we were able to assert what resulted from them. We also were able to assert an outgoing call to the API. And MobX is really great, and I encourage you to take a look at it because of the simplicity of what it provides here. But one of the nice things about end-to-end tests is we could have totally changed out our data store layer to use Redux or to use one of the many, many, many React state libraries that are out there, and your end-to-end test will protect you to ensure your application functionality is still working. So that's a lot of what we've done. That is our app. We have successfully test-driven some significant features in a React Native app. It's not gotten to the point where you could actually use this in production to save it, but so that relates to actually what I'm announcing to do next. So now that we've finished this React Native TDD resource, I'm really excited. I'm really excited that all these are recordings that are there for people, and I'm going to share them around and encourage you to share them around as well. My YouTube channel would be one of the great places to do it. You could also share reactnativetesting.io. This is a very, very unappealing visually website that I've set up to encourage and to have a central place to go for React Native testing. So I'm going to add these YouTube videos on here as a place to go for people to check and learn more about React Native testing. I would always love to hear more from folks about their experiences with testing on React Native. Let me know if you find these resources later and something's out of date, and I'd be happy to add description to update it. You can reach me on Twitter at codingitwrong. And yeah, I want to keep these resources up to date because I want it to be easy for people to get into testing and test-driven development, whatever platform they're on. So related to that, I want to talk about what I'm going to be live streaming on next. So since this has gone well, I've really enjoyed it. I hope you've enjoyed it as well. The next thing that I want to live stream is test-driven development using React on the web. So I played around with different ideas. I was thinking about Vue.js as well, but I think working on React on the web is going to be my best option to really participate in the conversation around testing. React is kind of the lingua franca of web front-end frameworks, and so someone that's using Angular or using Ember or using Vue, they're more likely to know how React works than React folks are to know how the other ones work, just because React is so widespread. And I want to talk about front-end testing, and I want to get people thinking about it using the same end-to-end test, the same outside-in testing approach we've used here on React Native. One of the reasons I want to do it is because there's a great testing tool called Cypress. If you follow me on Twitter, you've probably heard me talk about it. I have had people ask me before if I work for Cypress because I talk enough enthusiastically about it. But Cypress is a cross-platform acceptance testing framework for the web. And so I was super pumped when Cypress came about because it meant that whether I was working in React or Vue or anything else on the web, on the front end, or even with server-rendered pages, that I could use Cypress for testing as well. Cypress has a similar experience to using Detox in that it's a gray box testing framework. It kind of hooks into your app a little bit into the browser to know what's happening to make sure your tests are reliable and as free of flake as possible. So Cypress I'm a huge fan of. I'm really excited to walk through it together with y'all and specifically to show the outside-in testing approach that I've learned and I'm advocating for here. I was a bit nervous to do this in the React world because there's different views on the test pyramid for sure and on testing in general. But I realized that what I want to do here is just start a conversation. And I have enough experience in front-end testing now. I've worked for about 6 or 7 months on a Vue.js big front-end application for a big client. And so I feel like I have enough experience now of the pain points of different ways to do testing that I can really advocate for this approach. But I won't say that it works for everyone. So I would love to hear folks' feedback. And so I'm excited to start this new React TDD streaming series starting next week, next Friday at the same time at 2 p.m. with y'all as we get our application set up together. See if I had any other things to share. Oh yeah, the last thing I would just say so I have a website called learntdd.in. So this is my cross-platform test-driven development tutorial website that I get into because I was very ambiguous about what platforms I wanted to work in and maybe wanted to work in all of them, but I knew that I wanted to do test-driven development. And I wanted a consistent style of test-driven development no matter where I was. And so just like we've been walking through in even more detail the React Native test-driven development flow here, React is documented here. And so if you want to get a head start for next week, you can check out React test-driven development. If you work more in Vue, you can check it out there. I even have some Cocoa Touch if you're working with iOS directly, Ember.js, and Rails. I don't have Angular on here. I haven't messed around with Angular enough to do it. So if anyone's there and likes Angular and likes this approach to test-driven development, I'd like to collaborate with you to put that together and to put it on the website here. That would be really awesome. But until next week, check out learntddin/React to see. This is the walkthrough that we're going to be doing on our first week. Our first week might be tool setup, but then our second week of TDD and React, we're going to be walking through this with one difference. For this TDD tutorial, we're using Cypress for unit testing, but I think I'm going to actually be using Enzyme on the web as well. That's more commonly used on just in React testing in general, so I think that's going to be good, and it's going to be good to stretch me because I've used Cypress React unit test on here a little bit, so this will give me a chance to compare it with with Enzyme for React on the web and see the pros and cons. We'll also be able to compare it with the experience on React Native here and see the difference that it gives us to be able to do deep mounting. So that's about it. That's our React Native TDD series. Again, thanks so much to everyone who's joined live or watching the recordings after the fact. Thanks for folks who have watched and shared it. I hope you've learned. I'm so excited to have this resource recorded. And who knows, we might do something else in the future with screencasts or a blog series or something even fancier with this material. But these resources will continue to be up and be free. And I'd love for you to check them out in the future. Share them to your friends. Do testing in React Native. See what you learn. Come back and share. I'm happy to tweet it out and keep the conversation going. Thanks for joining, and we'll catch you next time. And it's time to go to the slides. See ya.